What happens when a legendary actor who spent a lifetime defining American grit sits across from a host who's built a career out of cornering his guests? When Clint Eastwood walks into Good Morning America, he expects a conversation, not an ambush. But within minutes, words turn into weapons, smiles turn into smirks, and what begins as a polite interview erupts into one of the most explosive on-air confrontations in television history. And trust me, this talk show won't disappoint you. It'll be worth every second of your time. The lights on Good Morning America glow clean and even, every angle groomed for TV. George Stephanopoulos wears that familiar easy smile, voice smooth, posture relaxed, but his eyes are cool and measuring. Clint Eastwood walks in at 94, quiet and upright, the kind of calm that doesn't ask permission. He takes the chair without fuss and sets his hands on his knees, steady as a fence post. George shuffles a small stack of cards like he already knows the beats. The red light on the camera pops on, and the room gives a tidy round of applause. Clint nods once, eyes doing a slow sweep that takes in the host, the desk, the distance between them. George opens warm. "Clint, it's always an honor." "Glad to be here, George," Clint says, easy and even. They trade two quick lines about the new documentary, the kind of small talk that fills time without saying much. Then George tilts his head and changes speed. "Some say your idea of heroism is a little exclusionary, isn't it?" The room tightens. A few smiles drop as the word hangs there like a test. Clint doesn't blink. He gives a slight squint that means he heard the move, and he's not surprised. "I'm not sure what you're getting at," he says, tone dry but steady. George offers a polite shrug, the smile still on, but not reaching his eyes. Clint leans back half an inch, the kind of shift that says he's seen this setup before, and he's ready for the next question. George leans in, smile thin but sharp. "You've always had strong opinions, Clint. The RNC chair, the empty seat." He says it like a challenge disguised as curiosity. Clint doesn't flinch. "That was commentary, not confession," he answers evenly. George chuckles, the kind of laugh meant to sound casual but lands like a jab. "Oh, come on, Clint. When you mock a sitting president on national television, people listen." The room stiffens. Even the hum of the lights feels louder. Clint tilts his head, eyes narrowing just enough to show the shift. "I didn't mock," he says, voice steady but hardening. "I challenged. That's what men do when they still have spines," George straightens, forcing a calm tone to cover the sting. "You've built a career on nostalgia, Clint. Maybe it's time to catch up with the present." The words hang there, smug and heavy. Clint's lips pull into the slightest grin, the kind that carries more warning than warmth. His voice drops lower, rough but controlled. "I built a career on truth," he says. "The present could use more of it." For a second, the silence fell. George's eyes flicker, the first crack in his composure. George adjusts his papers, voice calm but with an edge. "You've shaped how America sees itself, Clint. Don't you think that comes with a moral duty?" Clint looks at him, expression unreadable. "Duty's not about pleasing people," he says, tone quiet but firm. "It's about telling the truth, even when it stings." George lets out a dry laugh. "Honesty can be subjective." Clint's answer is instant. "Not when you live it." The words cut clean. No emotion, no effort to soften the blow. Then comes silence. Long, steady, and unnerving. George flips through his notes, pretending to regain control. His tone sharpens, like a prosecutor more than a host. "You've said things that hurt people, Clint. About immigration, about certain movements. Words matter." Clint's eyes stay locked on him, calm but unyielding. "So do lies, George," he says evenly, "but I don't see you fact-checking your own network." The line lands like a punch. A quiet gasp escapes from somewhere off camera. George swallows, his throat tight, the practiced rhythm of his voice faltering for just a second. George lets out a careful breath, the kind that's meant to look calm but hides panic underneath. He forces a half smile. "This isn't about me, Clint. It's about accountability." His voice trembles just slightly on the last word. Clint doesn't blink. He leans forward, elbows on his knees, eyes steady and sharp. Then hold yourself accountable first, he says, quiet but hard enough to cut the air. You invited me here under false pretenses. The studio reacts. A few audience members shift in their seats. Even the crew behind the camera stop moving. George freezes for a split second, his mouth opening but no words coming out. That phrase, false pretenses, hangs in the air like smoke. He clears his throat, stammering, "Now wait a second, that's—" But Clint interrupts with a calm, cold smile. "You wanted a headline, George, not a conversation." The line lands like a slap. The crowd doesn't know whether to gasp or applaud. George straightens in his chair, pretending control he doesn't have. "You came here voluntarily, Clint." "No one ambushed you," he says, words quick, brittle. Clint tilts his head, studying him with a slow, dangerous patience that made half of Hollywood terrified of his silence. "Questions are fine," he says evenly, the gravel in his voice tightening every syllable. "Traps are not." He pauses, lets it breathe just long enough for the cameras to zoom in, then adds, "You dressed this one up nicely, though." A ribbon of respectability wrapped around a setup. George's jaw tightens. His pen taps once against the desk, the smallest tell of a man cornered. "That's a strong accusation," he manages. "Only if it's not true," Clint replies. The studio feels smaller now, the air thick and electric. Clint leans back slowly, folding his hands in his lap, his calm now menacing. "You wanted drama?" he says softly. "You just got it." The crowd is silent, no one daring to breathe. Everyone knows it. The interview just tipped into a full-blown standoff, and George Stephanopoulos is losing control on his own show. George straightens his posture, his smile tightening into something brittle. "You're stuck in the past, Clint," he says, tone laced with a challenge. "You talk about integrity and grit like they still mean something in today's world." His words are meant to sting, but Clint doesn't bite. He leans forward, elbows on his knees, and looks at George the way a man looks at someone who's never lifted anything heavier than a microphone. His voice comes out low and steady, rough like gravel, but sharp enough to cut. "I've lived through more history than you've read, son. The Depression, Korea, the years when Hollywood didn't hand you a brand, you earned it with calluses and sleepless nights." George shifts in his chair, a quick flicker of irritation breaking through the polish. Clint keeps going, voice rising just enough to fill the room without shouting. "You call it the past. I call it experience. You think I'm behind the times because I still believe in backbone?" He leans back, eyes locked on George. "Let me tell you something. The future isn't built by people who forget where they came from." For a long second, the air turns electric. Clint exhales, his tone softening, but the power in it doesn't fade. "The past taught me integrity," he says. "It taught me that a man's word still matters. That respect isn't something you post. It's something you prove." He pauses, eyes drifting just past George, as if looking through the bright studio lights into something older, harder. "You don't erase history because it's inconvenient. You learn from it. You keep the parts that made you strong." George clears his throat, trying to interrupt, but Clint cuts in before he can. "You talk about progress like it's a parade, George, but sometimes it feels more like an excuse. A way to forget the work it took to get here." His voice drops lower, colder. "You sit behind that desk and call it accountability, but you're just keeping score. I lived through times when people didn't keep score. They just did the job." The tension stretches so thick it feels alive. George leans forward, trying to recover the high ground. "The world's changed, Clint," he says, grasping for control. "People expect more now." Clint meets his gaze and answers, quiet but lethal. "No, George. People expect less, and call it progress." The crowd is silent. George looks away for the first time, the weight of the words hitting him harder than any headline could. Clint's face is calm, almost gentle, but behind his eyes burns that old, dangerous steadiness. The look of a man who's fought his whole life, not for attention, but for truth. George shifts in his chair, the smile gone now, replaced by something sharper. His voice carries a hint of frustration he can't quite hide. "But what if the house you defend," he says slowly, "was never built for everyone?" The question lands heavy, loaded with accusation. Clint lets the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uneasy before he answers. Then rebuild it stronger, he says firmly, but don't burn it down for clicks. His tone is measured, but there's an edge underneath it that cuts straight through the polished air of the studio. George forces a smirk, trying to regain ground. That's easy to say for someone who's always had the spotlight, he shoots back. Clint chuckles quietly, that low, dangerous laugh that has ended more than one argument before it began. Spotlights don't protect you, son, he says, voice rough but steady. They just make your lies easier to see. The line slices through the room. The air shifts. Even the lights seem to dim, like the studio itself is reacting. The audience murmurs softly, a ripple of disbelief mixed with admiration. George's jaw tightens, but he can't find a comeback fast enough. Clint's eyes never leave him. No raised voice, no theatrics, just presence. Every second that passes feels heavier than the last. George clears his throat, fighting to keep his composure. You can't accuse me of dishonesty just because the questions are tough, he says, trying to sound controlled, but his words come out tight. Clint leans in slightly, elbows resting on his knees, his face calm, almost gentle. You're not asking questions, he says quietly. You're auditioning for outrage. The line hits the room like a crack of thunder. George blinks, caught off guard. The rhythm of the interview shattered. A camera operator whispers, "Did he just say that?" And the boom mic trembles slightly in midair. Clint sits back again, unhurried, eyes steady. He doesn't need to raise his voice. The silence does the work for him. George tries to laugh it off, a thin, nervous sound that dies halfway through. Clint keeps speaking, voice low and deliberate. You came here wanting a fight, not a conversation. You wanted a viral clip. Well, congratulations. You just made one. The audience exhales, a slow wave of realization. The power in the room has flipped completely. George, usually the one pulling strings, is now the one tangled in them. Clint sits still, watching him with that quiet, unwavering confidence of a man who's said his piece and doesn't need to say another word. George snaps. His voice is sharper now, stripped of polish. That's a serious accusation, he says, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The tension he's tried to hide all evening finally breaks through. Clint meets his stare without blinking, voice dropping low and firm. I'm not accusing, he says, each word deliberate, heavy. I'm confirming. The line hits like a thunderclap. The studio freezes. No one dares move. Even the cameras seem to hesitate, their faint mechanical whir fading under the silence. Half the room looks stunned. The other half looks afraid to breathe. George stammers, searching for footing. So you're walking away from accountability? He asks, voice cracking just slightly. Clint takes a slow breath, then rises from his chair, unhurried, deliberate. The microphone wire slips from his lapel as he unclips it. No, George, he says, tone cold but calm. I'm walking away from a bully. The audience gasps, a real, audible wave this time, the kind that no director could fake. George leans forward, desperate now. You can't just leave mid-interview, he says, his voice raised for the first time all night. It's part plea, part panic, the sound of a man realizing he's lost control of his own show. Clint stops mid-stride and turns his head slowly, catching the light in a way that silences everyone. His voice is rough but steady, the kind of voice that doesn't need to shout to dominate a room. Conversation ended when you stopped listening, he says. The sentence lands like a hammer. It doesn't echo. It sinks. George opens his mouth, but nothing comes out. The lights hum above. The cameras stay locked on Clint's profile as he turns back toward the exit. The studio that once felt bright now feels cold, every reflection sharp as glass. The fight is over. The smoke still hangs, but the fire just walked out. Clint rises from his chair, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement that carries weight without effort. Every step he takes feels like a strike of judgment. Not loud, not theatrical, but final. The studio floor seems to echo beneath his shoes, each sound sharper than the last. George sits frozen, his cue cards limp in his hands, eyes following the man who just dismantled his show without raising his voice. The cameras try to keep up, their frames trembling slightly as operators adjust in real time. No one speaks. No one moves. Clint doesn't look back. The lights above cast long shadows down the aisle, catching the lines on his face. Not of age, but of certainty. 94 years old and still walking taller than the man half his age behind the desk. He isn't leaving in defeat. He's leaving as the last man standing. The camera holds its shot long after he's gone. The chair across from George is empty now, the microphone still dangling from its wire, the light catching the metal clip just enough to make it glow. The shot lingers, too long for comfort, long enough for the truth to settle. That seat isn't just empty. It's hollowed out, like a reminder of what just happened. It's no longer a guest chair. It's evidence. The silence around it feels heavy, sacred almost, like a moment the show wasn't built to hold. George shifts slightly, glancing toward it, but the image doesn't let him go. The spotlight that once crowned every guest now exposes what's left behind. The mark of integrity and the proof that truth doesn't need an audience to win. For a long moment, the studio doesn't move. No sound, no breath, just stillness thick enough to feel. George sits frozen, his script slipping from his hands and scattering across the desk like white confetti. The red light above the camera still burns, recording everything, refusing to look away. Then from the back of the room, a single clap breaks the silence. It's soft at first, hesitant, then another joins in, then another until the sound grows. Not loud, not stage, but real. It isn't applause for entertainment, it's respect. Clint Eastwood didn't storm off in anger. He walked away with principle, leaving something heavier than outrage behind. Truth. George looks down, realizing the worst part of all. The silence says more than he ever could. The camera lingers on the empty chair, the microphone still hanging like a relic of something honest. Then comes the voiceover. Quiet, steady, reflective. That night, integrity didn't lose. It simply walked away. The lights fade, slow and deliberate, until only the glow from the cameras remains. The hum of studio equipment is the last sound left. Mechanical, distant, almost reverent. The shot widens, pulling back to reveal the entire stage. The empty desk, the frozen host, and the chair that became a symbol. No music, no outro. Just the truth captured in real time, unedited, undeniable. Before you go, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us what you think in the comments. Keep that notification bell on, because the next confrontation is already loading, and it's bigger, louder, and far more shocking.